Thank y'all for coming out. Got a good sized crowd here. Our guest today is David Griffin, and disclaimer, he is my brother. He's been doing almost nearly 2 decades worth of research into the ghost ship called Octavius. Has anybody ever heard of Octavius before? I'm sure you've heard the story, but you've probably forgotten the name or heard it as a different name, but he'll be explaining all of that. Let's give him a big hand.
So thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm glad this was the best place you could find to be on a Friday night. Really exciting job, but I did have good internet access, fortunately. And so as I was browsing the internet in my spare time, I stumbled across this story, most likely on Wikipedia, and it was a head scratcher, as in, well, that's an odd story. How could this be true? I'll get into the details of the story here in a second. And I said, well, I need to look into this one a little deeper. And as I started digging, it's hard to find concrete details. And so I kept digging for the next 19 years. And so here we are tonight. So next slide, please. And so the overview of this story that I've been looking into for so long, it's a short story. It's been repeated over and over again. But the basic tenets of the story are that there's this whaling vessel in the age of sail that discovers a derelict ship frozen in the ice. And then most commonly discovered in the Arctic around 1775 or in the Antarctic around 1823. But those dates are subject to a lot of change. The discovering captain was most commonly named Warren. Warren's or Brighton. The derelict ship, the one that was floating around, was not named in earlier versions, but later was called the Octavius or the Jenny, also occasionally Gloriana. And the discovering vessel was not named in earlier versions, but later on called the Herald, the Hope, or Greenland. Now, the captain, frozen to death, seated at a logbook, pen in hand. And so you end up seeing depictions of it like this. Some guy like this. This is the sort of story I'm talking about. And the dates in the logbook that the captain was sitting in front of indicate that the boat and crew had floated among the ice for somewhere from 13 to 37 years prior to discovery. And versions since the 1950s say the vessel was the first to traverse the Northwest Passage with a dead crew on board. Now, if you read the history books, they'll say no one did it until 1906. And certainly no one did it eastward until 1954. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe there's something to this story. So let's see, keep going. And a classic excerpt from the story is that he was found to be a corpse in a green damp mold that covered his cheeks and forehead and veiled his eyeballs. He held a pen in his hand and a logbook before him, the last sentence in whose unfinished page ran thus: 11th November, 1762. We have now been enclosed in the ice 70 days. The fire went out yesterday, and our master has been trying ever since to kindle it again without success. His wife died this morning. There is no relief. And so with that grand statement, we have set up the basic story. And so next slide. And so it's appeared over 1,000 times that I've cataloged in books, magazines, newspapers, songs. And that opening song that I was playing is called Octavius by the British band Hissy Fit. They recorded it about 21 years ago, and the lead singer died last year, so I assume the band is disbanded. But we've also got videos on YouTube about it, we've got websites full of it, comic books, and even sermons, and all that has been done in numerous languages. Herman Melville, Moby Dick fame, mentioned the story in a letter in 1850. It's appeared in the New York Times twice, but it sort of seems like a tall tale. Where's the concrete evidence that this actually occurred? Now, if you're looking online, there's a Russian Wikipedia entry for Octavius, and there's the Cyrillic transliteration if you're interested. is the best publicly available history of the story. However, they missed a lot. And I'm going to tell you some more tonight. So next slide. And if you are into video games, and this looks like a type of crowd that's heavy into video games, and you have played Assassin's Creed 3, you might have come across this particular ship, the Octavius, in that game as well back in 2012. So next slide. And so here is the problem. As I started to trace this story backwards in time, you run into books like this that have titles like Strange But True. And you'll find that if they have to tell you it's true, well, oftentimes it's not true. And so I'm skeptical here. Like, this story, I don't know. This is not boding well for the factual, historical accuracy of the story as told. But anyway, Donald Sobel, the same person who did the Encyclopedia Brown stories, he wrote about it, 1973. There's others, sort of hidden highlights. And so I'll stop for a moment and say, has anyone heard of this story before? Does any of it sound familiar to you? Some of you came across in your, because I can read about 5 minutes the story in more detail so that you know it, if you haven't heard it before, because I don't want you to be completely unaware. And so I can stop for a moment and I can read a short version of the story, if that is of interest to you. Yeah. All right, well, we'll do that. And so I'll read this particular version. There's lots of them, as I said, but this one will give you a nice short version done by Donald Sobel. So this one was titled The Floating Coffin. On the morning of August 12th, 1775, the Greenland whale-ship Herald was picking her way among the icebergs of the North Atlantic. Suddenly, the lookout bellowed, "A ship! A ship! West ahead!" On deck, the Herald's captain turned in surprise. Some 3 miles away, he saw masts poking above an iceberg. Slowly, a 3-masted schooner drifted into view. Her sails hung in tatters. Ice coated her spars and rigging. She glistened in the sun. Captain Warren studied her through his telescope. He saw no signs of life. Veering closer, he hailed the strange ship. Silence greeted his shouts. The schooner continued on her seemingly aimless way. "Lower the longboat," Captain Warren ordered. "I'm going to have a look." His crew was superstitious and had no mind to venture aboard a ghostly ship. Nevertheless, they obeyed. Captain Warren picked 8 men and rowed over. As the longboat neared the schooner's stern, the men made out her name, Octavius. She was unknown to them. Again, Captain Warren hailed her. Only rotting timbers and the wind and the loose rigging answered him, creaking and whispering. With 4 of his crew, the captain climbed aboard. The deck was slippery with ice and crusted snow. Seeing no one topside, the boarding party went below. In the crew's quarter, they found 28 men frozen to death. Each lay in his bunk, heavily bundled in blankets and clothing. The fierce Arctic cold had perfectly preserved their bodies. Next, the investigating crew entered the cabin of the captain, whose body was seated in a chair by a work table. In a cabin behind this one were 3 more corpses. A woman lay in one bunk, her head resting lifelike on her elbow. The body of a man sat cross-legged on the floor in one corner. His hands held a flint and a piece of steel. Before him was a pile of wood shavings. Death had overtaken him as he struggled to light a fire. Alongside the man was a sailor's jacket. Captain Warren lifted it. Beneath was the body of a small boy. The men of the Herald had seen enough. They wanted to get off at once. But the captain wanted to investigate further. He managed to inspect the galley, but he found no food there. By then, his men were on the verge of panic and threatening mutiny. Taking the schooner's logbook, Captain Warren reluctantly returned to his ship. He watched the Octavius and her cargo of death drift northward out of sight. She would never be seen again. Later, when he retired to his cabin to read the logbook, the captain discovered that all but the first and last pages were missing. The sailor to whom he had entrusted the book had allowed the rest to fall out. The first page included the information that Octavius had departed England bound for the China trade On September 10th, 1761, 14 years earlier, the last page had but a single entry. It was dated November 11, 1762 in red. We have now been enclosed in ice 17 days. Our approximate position is longitude 160 west, latitude 75 north. The fire went out yesterday, and our masters are trying to rekindle it again, but without success. He has handed the steel and flint to the mate. The master's son died this morning, and his wife says she no longer feels the terrible cold. The rest of us have no relief from the agony. Captain Warren's eyes returned to the words longitude 160 west, latitude 75 north. The meaning was incredible. On the day of the last entry in the logbook, Octavius had been icebound in the Arctic Ocean north of Point Barrow, Alaska, thousands of miles from where Captain Warren had just boarded her. A continent of ice lay between these 2 points. What Octavius had negotiated was the legendary Northwest Passage. For hundreds of years, sea captains had sought a shorter route between the Atlantic and the Pacific to carry trade between Europe and the Far East. The Northwest Passage was a dream that could eliminate the long voyage around the tip of South America. Apparently, the captain of the Octavius also had decided to try to find the Northwest Passage instead of sailing home to England around South America. He had tried, and like so many before, he had found death instead. But the Octavius had succeeded on her own. Year after year, she had sailed on, her ship's wheel unattended. She had inched eastward through the vast fields of ice, blindly withstanding the fury of the elements, till she finally floated again in the North Atlantic. Not until 1906, 130 years later, did another ship, Joa, commanded by the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, navigate the Northwest Passage. But Octavius had been the first, carrying a captain and crew who had been frozen for 13 years. So, absolutely true, according to Mr. Soball. So that is a version. There are lots of versions, and we'll get into some of those. So that was the context of my journey into studying this story. So next slide, please. Another older book from 1965 was Invisible Horizons. True Mysteries of the Sea. Must be true, right? He told you it was true. And Vincent Gaddis is famous for coining the term Bermuda Triangle, another extremely true phenomenon of nature. And so again, we're confronted with, this is not sounding so good for the truthfulness of this story. We're gonna have to keep digging. So next slide. And so we end up with, the next step along the way was Strangers in Science, Frank Edwards. He did a radio show where he talked a lot about UFOs and Forteana. That's the phenomenon popularized by Charles Fort. This mysteries of nature and things like that. And I'm betting he did something about the Little Green Man of Kelly. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure he discussed that on one of his radio shows. So next slide. Fate Magazine, 1953. This was the very first version to mention Point Barrow, Alaska. So as you see, details are added and changed along the way. We're starting to see a trend here. And next slide. And so I'm going to take some detours as we go along this story, but I'll tie them in eventually. And so let's talk about this fellow, Captain Dodd Forsborn. Probably a bit ambitious to call him a captain, but he did actually captain a vessel. Now he stole it, by the way, but he did captain it. The girl Pat, 1936, stole it in England, took it across the Atlantic, and reached Guyana in South America after 80 days. And he spent 18 months in prison for his theft, and while he was there, he decided to start a second life as an author. So next slide. And so he had some interesting stories he liked to tell. And some of the names, like this one right here, is the Master of the Girl Pat. That is his story of crossing the Atlantic in that stolen vessel. But you also see, covers like this, Mission Danger, Danger is My Destiny, I Sailed Through Hell, The Jinx Curse, The Medicine Man Meets His Match. And so some odd titles that may lead you to believe or understand the genre he was involved with. And so in post-World War II, these men's adventure magazines were very popular. And this was for all the boys who missed out on the adventure of World War II, and they also missed out on all the death and destruction of World War II, fortunately, as well. But they envisioned themselves being on these grand adventures, and there was always, usually some scantily clad woman in distress, and it's going to be this woman's savior as well. That was another major theme of these magazines. And so, in 1950, he wrote an article for Saga magazine, the next slide, and this was the very first version of the story to use the ship names Octavius or Harold, some new dates he introduced. He mentioned, it was the very first one to mention China or the Northwest Passage, the registrar or shipping, and then being near Alaska. This is the first time this has ever been noted as a source of the Octavius version of this story, and that is because no version of this magazine exists online. As far as I can tell, there's about 4 copies of this in existence, and this is one of them. And so it's not online, which is why no one has ever put it together that this is a version. It was the source for this particular line of the story. And so this, Dodd Orsborn, quite the storyteller, but I'm sure it's all true, right? Anyway, so that's one version of the story. This is the source for that version. Never been noted before, but it is a good point to understand how this story has evolved over time. Well, let's talk about some other versions of those. Next slide. And so this leads me to the challenge of researching this story, because there's endless versions of it that have been repeated over and over. And to thwart historians, normally they give no attribution, like they wrote the story. Well, where did it come from? I don't know. And some of them did say some attribution, but most of them didn't. And when they did, it was usually wrong. Like in the 1840s, there was hundreds of publications that started saying, yep, it appeared in the Westminster Review. That was a premier London publication. It was very prestigious to be in that publication. And so a lot of people said, yep, this story came from there. And it didn't. And so as this story evolved over time, they frequently changed the details, they changed names and dates. The Arctic to the Antarctic was an early change. We'll get to that one a little later. So next slide. And so you'll see these depictions of it. They had some good drawings. Here is, the mate trying to light a fire underneath this pot. So he got his kindling here. He's got his little flint here, trying to strike a fire. They come in and discovered this scene. And here's the captain at the table in front of his logbook. I peered into his face. Not only that's so dramatic, but anyway, they like to put these engravings in the stories when they mentioned the book, and they thought it looked very interesting. It is visually interesting, and it's one of the reasons why the story has stuck around for so long, because of these depictions that have existed. So next slide. All right, and if you are also needing to preach a sermon, this has entered the world of sermons as well, starting in 1866, using it as a religious allegory for going through life without productive activity. You're just floating along like a derelict with frozen people on board. And it was Talmage, Thomas DeWitt Talmage, who was a Brooklyn Presbyterian pastor starting in 1872, who repeated it in numerous books and has been borrowed by numerous preachers since then. And his quote was, "How many there are, we meet them every day, who seem to live but are frozen dead men. Oh, that God would turn all such present into the warm Gulf Stream of his love." And I found a sermon as recently as 2010 where someone is still using it. So, next slide. All right, let's talk about John Franklin. In 1845, he departed England trying to find the Northwest Passage. There was lots of these folks along the way who tried to sail a vessel to the Northwest Passage because they knew it was there. They knew physically there was water all along the coast of the northern side of North America, and all I had to do was just go through it, right? And so, well, the ice had other, things in place for them, and so on his 2 ships, the Erebus and Terra, he left in 1845. And of course, they were trapped in the ice. And everyone likely died from hypothermia and disease by 1848. But the British Admiralty became concerned, So they sent out search parties beginning in 1847. They found some artifacts in northern Canada in 1850. And it really captured the public imagination because his story was all over the newspapers. Everyone was speculating what would happen to him, where was he, will he ever be found safely? Don't know, but that inspired hundreds of reprints of this story in newspapers at that time because everyone was thinking about the fate of John Franklin, and that reminded all these newspaper editors of, hey, I remember a story, very similar to this. Let's reprint that story. And so it was reprinted quite a bit. But just for, context, those wrecks were finally found in 2014 and 2017, but Franklin's body has never been found. So, next slide. And so you keep tracing this story backwards and backwards, and there's endless newspaper articles, but this is the origin of the Captain Warren's version. It does not have the name Octavius in it. And this was, the Albion is an old term for Great Britain. And so this newspaper primarily ran British articles. And it's the earliest known example of Captain Warren's version from 1828. Now the author was not stated, but John Sharon Bartlett was the editor. That is not the John Barron that was involved with Bartlett's quotation, different person. And so this one has never been in the public either, in terms of noting as a reference for Octavius, for the frozen ship stories. And then after this one was published, it started appearing in lots of newspapers. And then by the end of the year, it started showing up in British newspapers, meaning that the newspapers from the United States had crossed the Atlantic and gone to London, and it started showing up in the papers over there. However, that didn't stop people in the United States from saying, oh, this came from a late London paper. And no, it started in the United States and went to London, and then that's how it occurred. So yeah, that's another version that I've traced the origin to, this Captain Warren's version, where most of the details are the same, but doesn't have the name the Octavius in it that the later versions did. That was added, in 1950 by this guy. So next slide. If you are from Australia, you're probably familiar with a different version of the story. And so in that version, in 1860, a Captain Brighton on the whaler Hope discovered the Jenny in the ice near Antarctica. So not the Arctic, but this is the Antarctic. And the last entry in the logbook was dated 1823. And so this story was mentioned in a respected scientific journal in January of 1965, the Polar Record. And then they even did a follow-up in 2022, just a couple years ago, about the story. And so if you ever take a cruise ship from Argentina and South America and head towards Antarctica, so South America is over on this side of Antarctica from looking at the polar view, and you come down here, quite a few of them go by King George Island, and there on King George Island, you'll find something called the Jenny Buttress, which is named for this ship. And if you ever go there, please take a photo of it, because I'm not aware of any known photo. And so I would like to see that someday, because, yeah, who knows what it looks like. Just a big pile of ice as far as I can tell. And the reason it entered Australian lore was because in 1947, Rosemary Dobson wrote a poem called The Ship of Ice, which won a contest in the Sydney Morning Herald. And so it got a lot of publicity out off of that. And that was inspired by a book written also in Australia the year before. And so you probably knew that at some point, Ripley's Believe It or Not would come up in this story. And it does, 1931. And this is the first mention of this branch, the Jenny branch, in English. And so Ripley's always had the claim that all of his stories could be backed up with facts somewhere. Oh, I didn't make that up, but it has facts behind it. And so he had his researcher, Norbert Perlroth, sitting in the New York Public Library pretty much full time for decades, coming up with all the stories that went into the panels that he put in the newspapers and his books. And so that person, Mr. Perlroth, probably, he brought the story into English, but he probably got it, next slide, from Globus, a German magazine which was published in 1861. And the Globus, the image that went with that article was on the very opening slide that I used when y'all walked in this evening. And so that came from that article. And for that, there was lots of versions in German and French newspapers, and that leads me to Annales Maritime Colonial, which was a Paris publication in 1829. And it is, at the same time, it appeared in several French newspapers in October of 1829, and they credited the Liverpool Courier. And so I sat in the British Library going through the microfilm for several hours trying to find it in that publication, and I don't think it's in there. Certainly not any time around this time frame. And so yet again, you're frustrated by their incorrect attributions of where this thing came from. But in this version, in this early version from 1829, the ship was found in May of 1828, and that is the likely origin of the Jenny and Captain Brighton branch of this story. And once again, it's the first time this has ever been publicly noted as a reference for this particular story. And that leads to the last one. Wait a minute, wasn't this ship found in 1860? And so if they were writing about it in 1829, how could it have been found in 1860? Well, later on they wanted to revise the dates to make it more convenient for the story they were telling at the time. So you see this ongoing again and again. The story just keeps evolving. And so we've gone through three branches, so far. One was, Octavius branch. One was the Captain Warren's branch, and this is the Captain Brighton branch. So we've gone through three versions of this story. And so, next slide. And so if you go back farther than that, there is another story called The Ice Ship by Tom Spunyarn. And so with a name like Spunyarn, absolutely it has to be true, right? But 1825, the Nautical Intelligencer was a foul-mouthed Massachusetts newspaper. Unfortunately, no copy of that newspaper exists, but there were some that were published shortly after that referenced that newspaper. And they say from an old sea captain's manuscript. So it has to be true then, right? So no dates or names, this particular version, but it did say it took place in the Baltic Sea. They found a frozen derelict vessel. A captain was seated at a log, some of the similar things. And they reprinted numerous newspapers through 1828. And some were credited to a guy named Ichabod. And that's an interesting name. We'll get to that a little later in the story. And so this is the oldest published story that's directly linked to this genre of stories of frozen ships, floating around in frozen waters. And so that takes us back 200 years, but I said this was the 5-century journey of a frozen ship, so we've got more to go. And so let's see where this leads next. And so I just want to pause for a moment and ponder, why do people find this story so fascinating? Why has it been repeated so many times throughout history? And I think some of it is, particularly during the 19th century, there was a fascination with these blank spots on the map and exploration. And some of the last places to be explored were in the frozen places because they're really hard to get to, really demanding of the crews to just stay alive and come back and tell the tale. And then, in that 19th century, as they were going off to these far northern and southern places, a lot of sailing vessels did get stuck, in the Arctic and frozen in the polar seas. And most times they didn't die there because oftentimes they were able to free themselves, or at least they just walked away from the ship it was frozen away, like the Endurance with Ernest Shackleton and how he did. The ship sank, but the crew survived because they just abandoned the ship and walked away. And so that's one reason, I think, our interest in exploration. Another reason is just iconic way to die. You're just frozen there writing your last story. And sort of captures the imagination. You're definitely thinking about the story. Also, people love a good ghost story. People love, hearing about, bizarre ways to die. In the age of sail, sailors were also very superstitious. I mean, they didn't know what the weather was going to be like. They didn't know exactly where they were. They didn't have GPS. And so they're always concerned about dying in ghastly ways, being cursed in some way. And so they didn't want this to happen to them. But the stories got told over and over. They're swapping stories amongst the crew and the ports. But it also has enough details to seem plausible. If you just told a story of once upon a time, well, then everybody knows it's made up. But you put in some actual details and places and names and dates, now it's like, well, this could be true. So it really grasps your imagination. However, wink, wink, seems to be made up, And so people felt free to modify it and give it a new life. And so that's why, let's just make this new story, send it on its way again with a new version because I find it so fascinating. So I wanted to ponder that for a moment, about just why people repeat this. But let's keep going back in history and see what we can find. And so there's some other stories of the sea that were commonly told before 1825. And the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner was a popular one by Samuel Taylor Coleridge from 1798. This is a story about an old mariner. It tells about a ship he was on that was driven to the Antarctic, and an albatross leads him out of an ice jam, but the sailors shot the albatross. The crew believes they're now cursed and blame the mariner, and the crew dies off one by one until only the mariner remains. The ship sinks, but the mariner is rescued, and the mariner is forced to wander the earth, telling a story to teach a lesson to others. So this is not directly related, but it's just, these types of stories of dying in unusual ways and being cursed and superstitiousness, it did occur, in stories throughout the ages of people in the age of sail. The next slide. Another one was the Flying Dutchman story. Goes back to at least 1790, usually associated with the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. The ship's crew is guilty of some transgression and dies at sea, and the ghost vessel is doomed to sail the seas forever. And so sailors on other vessels would see the Flying Dutchman sailing away, and if they see that, that's a curse on them, and they're probably going to have bad luck ahead. Another story you see? All right, so let's see what's next. And so if you go, let's talk about another detour here. Let's talk about this guy for a moment. If you go to Bowling Green, off of, I think it's Cave Mill Road, near Greenwood Mall, there is a Sir Willoughby Court, a road. And I'm pretty sure it's named for this person. I can't be certain, but I'm pretty sure it's named for this person. I don't know why it'd be a road there named for him, but I don't know who else it'd be named for. So anyway, in May of 1553, 3 boats departed London under the command of Hugh Willoughby. They were searching for the Northeast Passage. So as we said, the Northwest Passage is where you try to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic over the top of North America. Then the Northeast Passage is where you go from the Atlantic to the Pacific over the top of Eurasia. And so if you're starting in London, you may be more interested in this trade route to China. And so that's what he was trying to find back in 1553. And so the ships became separated in bad weather in July of that year. One ship was actually successful. They did something interesting. And they went on to Russia, and they met Ivan the Terrible, and they established a northern trade route between the two countries. They actually continued for quite a while, and so that was the one success in this otherwise disastrous trip. And the 2 other ships with Willoughby wandered the area and became trapped in ice near the mouth of the Varzina River on the Kola Peninsula of Russia. And so Willoughby wrote his will in January of 1554, presumably because he expected bad things to occur soon. And by spring of that year, 2 ships and the dead crew were found by Russian fishermen. And in the summer of 2 years later, English crews attempted to retrieve those ships, but they sank near Scotland. Now, unfortunately, they had also picked up a Russian ambassador to bring back with them, and he survived, made it to Scotland, received there, and so it kept those good graces between the 2 countries going. All right, next slide. And so, as I mentioned, they departed London, came down the Thames, went out to the North Sea, went along the coast of modern-day Norway, and one ship went here into the White Sea to Archangel, and then went down to Moscow. That was a successful one. Now, the unsuccessful ones ended up right about here on the coast of the Kola Peninsula in modern-day Russia. And that's where they were found dead the following spring. So next slide. And Willoughby's journal did return to London. It became part of the Cotton Library. It was mostly destroyed by a fire. It's now stored at the British Library. And so you can see the charring around the piece of paper. And then right here, in some interesting language, it says the haven of death. So this is the marginal note that he left in his diary about what was going on. And so that does not bode well for the outcome of their journey. So why did I tell you that? Well, we're going to take another detour. Next slide. Venice. This is the Basilica de Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari in Venice. If you have been to Venice, you have probably walked by this church. but in a city full of great churches, including St. Mark's Basilica, in a country full of great churches, including St. Peter's Basilica, you probably forgot about this one. And I'm not interested in the church. But right next to the church, in this building right here, is the State Archives of Venice. And in the 19th century, the British government sent a lot of researchers throughout Europe to try to recreate some of the documents that they lost in the Great London Fire of 1666. And Rod and Brown went to the archives there in Venice and started digging through all of the dispatches they had related to London and England from the time period before the Great Fire. And so next slide. And he found amongst them a dispatch from Giovanni Michel, the Venetian ambassador in London, that was dated the 4th of November, 1555, and it described Willoughby's journey. And so I'll read this excerpt to you, translated from the Italian. The vessels which departed hence some months ago, bound for Cathay, which is China, either from inability or lack of daring, not having got beyond Muscovy, Moscow, and Russia, whither the others went in like manner last year, and so this was in 1555, referring to 1554, having returned safe, bringing with them the 2 vessels of the first voyage, having found them on the Muscovite coast with the men on board all frozen. And the mariners now returned from the second voyage, narrate strange things about the mode in which they were frozen, having found some of them seated in the act of writing, pen still in hand, and the paper before them, others at table, platter in hand and spoon in mouth, others opening a locker, and others in various postures like statues, as if they had been adjusted and placed in those attitudes. They say that some dogs on board the ships displayed the same phenomenon. They found the effects and merchandise all intact in the hands of the natives and brought them back hither with the vessels. Very interesting. Next slide. And so that dispatch was not publicly known until 1877. It was, within the archives of Venice until that time. So this was not the direct source of any of the published story versions that we know, but it does establish what was publicly known in the public, knowledge about Willoughby, though exaggerated. And so Willoughby's voyage is the most likely inspiration for all of these frozen ship stories. And so tracing it all the way back, 5 centuries ago to 1553, and Hugh Willoughby's journey was an important understanding, about the story, and understanding of how they were talking about the story at the time when they came back. And it all seems to fit together of how these voyages inspired. And centuries later, people had the common knowledge of these types of voyages and used it as the source when they were writing their own tall tale of the seas. All right, next slide. But even if these stories are fictional, well, someone wrote them. And most of the time they didn't tell you who it was. Well, who was it? I think, well, this is such a captivating story. It's hard to imagine that this is the only thing they wrote. And they were likely successful authors because they were pretty good at writing. And so I started looking at unusual phrases in the story, and I searched through Google Books to try to find some contemporary occurrences of those phrases. And this is a type of stylometry, where every author has a unique blend of vocabulary, phrases, and word order that can be statistically analyzed, pretty much fingerprint that author. They've done it, in recent years for some, how to publicize, stories where books are published anonymously or something. They'll unearth who the actual author is. And then J.K. Rowling had that occur to her when she published some things that weren't in the Harry Potter universe. And so I did not search for any similarities with the Jenny version because of uncertainty about what the original version was. It didn't appear in English until 102 years after it was first written, so I didn't do that one. But I did find some candidates with enough commonality to merit further analysis. Now, I'm not going to claim these people are the author, because you've heard their names, but I think we should look further into this topic of who wrote these stories. But with the caveats that it's more likely to find similarities with prolific, widely published authors. The more things you write, the more likely it is you wrote some things that are probably of the, that using some of the similar words. So I can't prove it, but I think there's something to look into here. So let's talk about the Captain Warren's version of the story that traced back to 1828. Who may have written that one? And so these are some of the phrases that I found that were fairly rare. I mean, even if they sound somewhat common or even common today, at that time they weren't used a lot. And so if you can find an author who used these same phrases in their writing, well, there's a possibility there's some connection between the two, particularly the ones that are fairly rare. I mean, if there's only a handful of authors using these phrases, and you find another author using a bunch of them, well, that's some good evidence to dig deeper. And so I found an author who used all these terms that came from that version of the story that was around in 1828. So next slide. You may have heard of this guy, Washington Irving. And so some of the evidence to support why he may have been the author of it is that, well, he done a hoax himself back in 1809 with Diedrich Knickerbocker, and the New York Knicks today comes from that name. He wrote under several pseudonyms. Now, he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, as you're aware, and had a character named Ichabod. Now, the Captain Warren's version didn't use the name Ichabod, but we'll get to why that may still be significant. The Storm Ship is a short story about a ghost ship. The Adventure of a German Student, which he wrote in 1824, shares several similarities with some of the terms that you use in that story. And so in 1828, when he would have written the story, if he did, he was living near Cadiz in Spain. And when he was writing about Christopher Columbus and spreading lots of lies about Christopher Columbus, particularly that people thought the earth was flat, you can credit him with that. Now the case against, I do want to be fair here, case against, I looked through his diary for the years of 1828 through 1829, and he doesn't mention writing any articles that would be along this line. So maybe he just didn't put it in there, maybe he didn't write it. I don't know. Again, I think he is someone that should be looked at further of whether he was involved in writing this story. All right, so let's go to another branch of the story, the ice ship version, the one by Tom Spunyarn from 1825. And so here were some other phrases that I pulled out. A couple of them were pretty rare. Daredevil was a very rare word at the time, but that one appears in the story. You got this phrase here about order, making best of their way, and dimly distinguished. And some of these phrases are a little rare at the time. But I found an author who used all of these phrases in their writing. And so again, could be a candidate for further investigation for this particular version of the story. And so Walter Scott, he was a friend and mentor to Washington Irving. And so he would have known obviously about Sleepy Hollow and Ichabod. He wrote, there was an article about Willoughby that appeared in Edinburgh Magazine in 1818. And Scott published stories in that magazine the same year. And there was same year he also wrote a review of the book of science fiction lore, the Frankenstein novel by Shelley. He wrote a review of that in the same year. And in 1825, when he would have been writing the story, if he wrote it, a banking crisis in Great Britain led to the collapse of a printing business owned by Scott, and he was financially ruined. And so he tried to write his way out of debt. And he wrote several short stories about the supernatural and the macabre, the letters on demonology and witchcraft, which he wrote in 1830, included stories of ghosts on ships. He died in 1832. Now, to be fair, a case against, he was famous enough that he probably could have made more money publishing under his own name. So why would he have written this anonymously? I don't know. Again, I think there's more to investigate here. I'm not an expert in stylometry. If you have some sophisticated software, you can actually do a lot more with this, looking at word order and things like that. And so I may try to do some more of that investigation next. The next slide. And so that is the end of what I know from 19 years of researching this line of stories about frozen ships found with frozen crews on board. I appreciate your participation and attention, but does anyone have any questions? All right, I've told you all that I know. Well, at least I know a lot more actually. This is summarized in just 1 hour and 20 minutes. So I've gone over a little bit. So if you don't have any questions, I'll tell you about what I'm working on next. Next slide. And so Clark Stanley, the Rattlesnake King, most famous snake oil salesman, and his real name and life story have never been publicly revealed. Maybe sometime later we can come back and do a story on him too. But another interesting character from history, that a lot of people have heard vaguely about, have some vague memories of, and there's a particular story that's always told, but maybe there's more behind the scenes. So I thank you for your attention. I thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever heard about an airplane that crashed in Andes in South America? And they all stayed on the plane, and then they start eating.
Oh, the soccer team?
I don't remember very much, but not too long ago.
Yeah, I think it was
One
1960s.
survivor
Yeah,
was-
1960s.
Yeah, the one survivor was on television, they interviewed him, and,
Yeah, I think they produced a recreation of that in a film maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
I don't know, I just wondered,
It was a
I
couple of
remember
lives.
about it,
Yeah.
but it called my attention when they interviewed this gentleman, and he was the only survivor,
Yeah.
and he's still alive, and he told the story.
Yeah, they're the fascinating story of survival, sort of like
Yeah.
Shackleton's endurance. Yeah.
And it was Cordillera de Andes,
Mhm.
what is it, mountains of the Andes, how do you say that? It's the hills that make
Yeah.
it very high, the highest part of the South America.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story too.
Thank you. All right, so.
It's an airplane, it was a ship.
Yeah.
The modern version. But we got more questions, no more questions? Thank y'all for coming out.
Thank you.